Ngencha Pangarara Kanawara Yatana Wangandi Yarakumarta Ngadulichanga Wangariti Corona Miunecha Wanganti Namuranai Ngalichanga Yalana Wangandi Naigana Yatanga Yuwati Naichundi Yencha Yatanga Wa Tapa Purana Wingu Patirinti Wa Warayurdi.
I te taha o tōku koro, ko te horohoro inga o ngā ringa o kahumata momoi te maunga. Ko pokaitu te awa, ko ke aro te marae, ko Ngāti ke aro Ngāti tuarā te hapu, ko te aroa te iwi te waka. I te taha o tōku kuia, ko maua o te maunga, tauranga te moana, taki te mu te waka, pautū te rangi te marae, piri rākau te hapu, ko Ngāti rangi nui te iwi. Ko Natasha Demi Parekaua Martin tōku ingoa. It is my whakapapa that grounds me in place and time. And while this word is Māori, its meaning is understood by Indigenous people across the world. Because we all come from somewhere. We are connected. And we have responsibilities that reach backwards and forward. From our ancestors to those yet to come.
Ngadlu Mona Airports, classrooms Tapa Wanga, Ngadlu Yancha Padnindi, Wara Yaku Pipanga Padnindi, Wara Yatanga Padnindi.
Well, language isn't just words or sentences or even just how we communicate with one another. Our languages are how we understand the world around us. And for Indigenous people, our languages carry our culture, our knowledge systems, our values. And these are things you can't fully translate into English because they were never made for English. And for Ghana, after more than a century without the language being passed naturally between generations, we knew that if we wanted a future where children could grow up strong inside Ghana language, we couldn't just guess how to do it. We needed to learn from nations who have already done that hard work. Language groups who have faced disruption, grief, politics, funding battles, and still built something that works. And sure, as doctors, we also see the evidence. But honestly, we never needed a journal article to tell us what Indigenous people have always known. When children grow up grounded in language and culture, they grow up stronger in identity. And this shapes how their health and well-being evolve over a lifetime. So this journey was never really about travel and exploring. It was a responsibility. It was about finding real, practical ways to make sure future Ghana generations get what so many were denied.
We weren't chasing some perfect model to copy and paste. We were actually looking for courage and clarity. Courage in communities that said, our language has been hurt, but we're going to bring it back anyway. And clarity about how they went about it. How they moved from a few learners in a classroom to kids arguing, laughing, and dreaming in the language again. And we were looking for patterns we could bring home. Not just tips, but the deeper things. What you prioritize, what you protect, what you refuse to compromise on. Because we don't want Ghana Water to be something children visit once a week. We want Ghana Water to be a world they can live inside.
Ngadlu Purity Wilta Warpalainti, Ngencha Warpalai Kumarta, Yecha Warpalai Yalura.
We travelled across 10 weeks of learning, across oceans and nations, not to collect stories, but to be accountable to them.
Ngadlu Karala Badni Tirkaticha Tapa Indigenous Fluency System, Bira Yukoninga, Wa Ninku Nerliti, Wera Yokis, Bira Schnichaminga, Wara Pudna Kangalangalarna Ichanga, Narterna Ichanga, Bina Kangangapa Kanawagenga, Tapa Wadna First Peoples Cultural Council Inga, Narterna Tapa Walesinga, Kakangapa Pipawalinga, Mananinga, Inariela, Hinadlulu Wara Kagangapa Payi.
We throw immersion around so much it almost loses meaning. It's not bilingual lessons. It's not going back and forth between English and the language. And it's definitely not sprinkling a few words on top of an English program. What we saw in Yukon with the Indigenous Fluency Transfer System and at the Snitcham Foundation on Tsleil-Waututh territory was different. The language is the environment. Class starts, boom, you're in the language. Instructions, jokes, frustration, encouragement, all in the one language. At first, it feels like you've been dropped in the deep end. You miss English, you feel slow. But if you stay there long enough, you stop drowning and start swimming. Then you're not just surviving, you're diving, exploring, playing in that world. That's immersion. The language becomes the air you breathe, not a tourist stop for you to visit for an hour.
I came away really clear that good boundaries are an act of love and that they're essential in language work. In the Yukon, they were upfront about this. They explained that their language program is a fluency track and not a feel-good class. You need to show up to participate and to speak. And I think many of us have sat in the back of a language class and not actively engaged. But silence isn't a neutral act. Silence holds languages back. At the Children of the Taku Society, there was the principle that if you couldn't say it in language, don't say it in English. And at the Squamish language class, the group norms and expectations were on the wall, visible and displayed. Such boundaries don't exist to shut people out. They exist so that the language has one protected space where it's safe to be the priority. And for some languages, these classes and spaces may be the only place in the world where the language is dominant. It is with these boundaries that we are able to produce safe environments that enable people to be fearless and speak language and make mistakes, because it's only through mistakes that we can learn.
They all had structure that matched their passion. In Yukon, the Indigenous Fluency Transfer System had clear levels and everyone knew. This is intense. You will be pushed, but you're supported the whole way. If someone was struggling, they were called the newest learner, which is such a strength-based way to hold that. At the Snitcham Foundation, you could see the system just by looking at the walls, the syllabus, the roles, the expectations. Teacher-student ratios close to 1-to-1, students teaching each other. Routines refined over 10 years. They even trained people in the method itself, not just the language. In Ganawage, the adult immersion program built in regular contact with first language speakers. Their methods differed, but the pattern was the same. Clear structure, relentless participation, wellness built in, and a shared decision that the language sits in the center and not on the side.
There were so many moments, but I guess one that stayed with me was witnessing the children in the Bunskoolmanx immersion school and in the Siilasami school in Inari, Finland. These kids were doing completely ordinary things, teasing each other, asking for help, mucking around, but all in their language. No one stopped to translate. No one switched to English to make it easier. And then in Ganawage, we were among parents, learning alongside their babies and supported by home consultants who would help families bring the language back into everyday life. It was standing in these places that I realized, if Ghana has had more than a century without natural transmission, we can't rely on occasional classes or token phrases. We need whole environments. Dedicated spaces, homes, nests, adult programs, a school, where Ghana is the everyday language of life. For Ghana, immersion isn't a luxury. It's the bridge from survival to true intergenerational transmission.
Kaganga parlu marla wilta katindi, marla wiltarlu narna tarkita, narnara ngalulu kumarta yarta wariapinguta.
Often it was in what people said around the language rather than the language itself. In Canada, people were honest about residential schools, the 60s scoop, children punished for speaking their own language, and how that history doesn't stay in the past. It lives in families, it lives in the nervous systems, it lives in the way people show up to language spaces today. We heard comments like, "Did you learn your language on country?" Or people calling programs reverse residential school, or worries that you're taking money away from others. And one line that hit me hard was, "Of course, we show up ready to fight. We're still being assimilated. It should have been our birthright." We also heard how language work has strained families. Jealousy, judgment, conflict over who is doing it right. It made me realize a lot of tension in language spaces isn't because people don't care. It's because they care deeply and they've been hurt. If we don't recognize that, we take it personally and burn out. If we do recognize it, we can respond with more wisdom and less reaction.
Healing often wasn't loud or obvious. It was subtle. But I think this is because the work of language revitalization is so intense that often we get caught up and miss these byproducts. Healing is seen when a child is able to answer without switching to English. It's when an adult who has been silent for years tries out a new phrase. And healing is seen in the laughter. When a joke lands in language and everyone understands it, it's a powerful thing to witness. We saw deliberate healing too. In British Columbia, programs like Reclaiming My Language, which is adapted from Sami work, bring mental health practitioners alongside language leaders to support silent speakers to find their voice again. And this is really important because silence is not always a lack of interest. Sometimes it's the shape trauma takes. For me, healing looked like people standing a little taller in their language. And when a language starts moving naturally between generations, that's healing in action.
It means we can't treat this as just a teaching problem. We have to treat it as a whole of community work. We need Ghana spaces that are linguistically strong and emotionally safe. Places where we acknowledge what was survived, but we don't stay trapped in it. It also means understanding that lateral violence, criticism, and gatekeeping, as painful as they are, often come from fear and grief, not from people wanting the language to fail. So healing has to shape how we set boundaries, how we lead, how we protect people in the work, because if we don't, we risk reproducing harm in the very spaces that are meant to restore us.
The Our Living Languages exhibition on Vancouver Island helped put language trauma into a clear frame. It laid out the history, and understanding history is crucial to understanding the origin of trauma. Laws banning ceremonies, residential schools punishing children for speaking language, the 60s scoop, land loss, all these ways people were separated from language and culture. Methods and ways that have been seen across the globe when it comes to Indigenous languages. When you hold this history next to comments like, "That's not how my language is spelt," or "Who's given you permission or authority to use language?" it starts to make sense. These aren't just personality clashes. They're people trying to protect what was taken in the only way they've learned. That doesn't mean we let harm slide, but it changes how we respond. We can hold compassion for the pain and still say, we're going to keep this space steady because the next generations deserve something different. That balance, compassion with firm boundaries, is where sustainable language lives.
One was watching the end of day reflections at the Snitcham Foundation. Everyone shared something that worked and something that they'd change if they had $1 million or a time machine. It sounds like a simple thing, but it meant people weren't left stewing, they were heard. And the program kept evolving without losing stability. Another was in the Yukon, hearing about learners talk about brain melt, almost proudly. Like, if your brain melted, you learned something today. There was humor and pride woven into the struggle. Those moments reminded me healing isn't a grand finished state. It's daily practice. The routines that make it safer to keep showing up for yourself, for each other, and for the language.
Well, language reconnects us to everything colonization tried to cut us off from. Language carries our stories, our relationship to land, and our responsibilities to one another. So when people step back into that, they're not just learning grammar, they're remembering who they are. It doesn't fix every problem overnight, but it restores something deep that was never meant to be taken. And that, to me, is healing.
Marni na Charlie ngalu warpalayama moy merninti tapanga mintuni ticha yaku tanka pertundi.
They all started with a small group of invested and committed people, but they treated language as serious, long-term work. At the first People's Cultural Council, this looked like legislation backing the work, data collection, economic impact reports, and programs that build capacity over time, such as the Mentor Apprentice, Youth Empowered Speakers, and Reclaiming My Language. They were very clear, because you may never fully decolonize tertiary boards, so you learn to speak their language of outputs and metrics in order to protect the language of your people. At the Squamish lesson held by the Snitchin Foundation, it looked like 80 plus techniques, clear routines, tight ratios, and funding that let learners actually attend. It provided a culture where students know that they're here to work hard and that they will be supported. Different places, different systems, but the thriving ones shared a long-term vision, stable resourcing and clear roles, so it doesn't all collapse when one or two people get exhausted.
We need leadership that is deeply relational and also very clear. That means decisions are transparent, responsibilities are shared, and processes are fair, because conflict will come, and if the structure isn't steady, everything will collapse back into personalities and politics. We also need a workforce pathway, not just hoping teachers will appear. Adult fluency, teacher development, immersion educators, and those roles properly resourced so people aren't carrying an intergenerational responsibility on volunteer energy alone. And we need to be able to demonstrate that what we do is impartial, protective, and consistent. That builds trust, and trust keeps people in the movement.
I see one connected system, not separate projects. Warapudna, our language spring. Like the language nest we saw in Ganawage, where parents learn with their babies and home consultants support the language to be taken back and spoken in the household. Warapadi, the river, our adult immersion fluency program that builds teaching capacity, drawing from what we learned in the Yukon and with the Snitchin Foundation, ensuring readiness, intensity, participation, and wellness. And over time, an immersion school, like what we saw in Manan, Inari, and Ganawage, where children live whole days in language. If we design these as one system, fed by long-term investment, we're not just running classes, we're building the conditions for transmission.
Seeing where other communities started. The Squamish began with a small group willing to do the work, and over time, their speaker numbers grew even as first language speakers were lost. Wendat revitalization is drawing from archival material after nearly a century of disuse. Communities like the Ganawage, Inari Sami and makes building immersion from committed families and stubborn hope. When you see that, you stop waiting for perfect conditions. You realize if you have committed people, a clear vision, and protected spaces, you can begin. And you can build as you go. We already have learners, we already have resources, we have people with heart. That doesn't make the job easy, but it means we're not starting from nothing.
That language investment is not charity and is not optional. When you invest in language, you invest in identity, and identity strengthens families, which strengthens communities, which strengthens the whole nation. If you want long-term outcomes in health, education, justice, employment, you don't just fund programs around the edges, you fund the foundations. And for Indigenous peoples, language is one of the deepest foundations we have.
Tapa purana wara taikuringa, wara yaku kumarta, wara tapa puranila tikandi.
They showed me that in healthy communities, language and culture aren't separate subjects. They're the same thing expressed in different ways. In Inari, watching people do silverwork, leatherwork, woodwork, the language was woven throughout every step. Some tools and techniques don't even have an English name, so you literally have to be in the language to talk about the culture properly. At the fishing camp, culture wasn't an activity, it was a way of learning. The language traveled with the doing. It reminded me if we revive language without culture, we get something thin. If we revive culture without language, we lose depth. They're meant to grow together.
In Inari, we observe language learning through participation of cultural practices, fishing, silverwork, leatherwork, because sometimes when language is the sole focus, it can bring up shame, fear, judgment, and all this trauma sits really close to the surface and can be quite paralyzing for an individual. But when hands are busy and people are creating together, language can slip in more gently. People don't feel like they're being watched, but they are participating. This doesn't replace fluency pathways. We still need intensive adult programs to build capacity quickly, but it provides another entry point for people who want to learn and belong, and who might need a softer doorway into the language. We heard it directly from a learner at the Sami fishing camp. They explained how teaching can feel colonial, control, performance, judgment, whereas farming is different. Farmers prepare the soil, they plant seeds, they protect growth, tend to crops, provide the environment that the plant needs to thrive. But there's only so many elements that they can control. So this metaphor stuck because it's intergenerational. A farmer doesn't plant for today, they plant with faith in the future and responsibility to the land.
It means our curriculum and our spaces have to be culturally grounded, Ghana shaped, not borrowed shape. We can learn methods from all over the world, but the content, the values, the stories, the seasonal rhythms, those that have to come from Ghana Yada and Ghana ways of being. And we need both, the fast track that grows fluent adult speakers and the culturally embedded pathways that allow people to enter gently, safely, and stay for the long haul. Because in the end, we're not building a program, we are rebuilding a living world.
Ngadluku yarta yaku kulandi, mani ngadlu yara pankarana, wapalayama kumanka, yanka wama tartanyaka, Aotearoa, Kanaraila, Maninga, Kumarta Kumarta Pangarila.
The day we attended the Squamish language lesson, the first person I saw was wearing a jacket from my hometown, Tauranga Moana. And that stopped me, and I reflected on how special that moment was. Then again, in Inari Sami, I met a young man who attended my high school, and he had actually learnt my language, Te Reo Māori, before he'd begun to learn his own Sami language. These moments reminded me that our languages travel, our stories travel, and Indigenous people are interconnected globally. It didn't feel like we were meeting strangers on this trip. It felt like we were meeting relatives we just hadn't yet encountered.
It showed me that disruption is shared, but so is resurgence. In Mastuash, we saw politics and fragmentation and the complexity of governance. In Ganawage, we saw nests, schools built by parents who refused to wait for the perfect conditions. On Vancouver Island, the museum held the brutality but also resilience in the same room. In Inari, Wales, and Manin, the same story in different languages: loss, pressure, and then people choosing revival anyway. Solidarity told me if we're facing challenges, it doesn't mean we're failing, it means we're in the real work. The same work Indigenous peoples everywhere are doing. And our responsibility is here on Garniarta to carry what we have learned home with integrity.
Ngadluku wapulai yanga.
The vision had shaped. Before the trip, we had the bigger picture, but we hadn't seen enough examples of what next could look like. Coming home, it felt like the fog lifted. We could see adult fluency pathways, early years ecosystems, protected immersion spaces, and governance structures that hold pressure. And I looked at our own community differently, not as behind, but as already moving. The soil is ready.
We brought back strategies, but also validation. Validation that this can work, that you don't need a huge crowd to begin, that you can start before everything is perfect, and that wellness and boundaries are not extras. They're how you keep a movement alive. We also brought back responsibility to honour the generosity of the communities who shared their hard-won knowledge with us by actually applying it right here on Garniata.
And the world doesn't exist in isolation. It's part of a global movement.
We're walking towards an ecosystem, not a single project. Waterpudna is our early years immersion with families where Ghana can be normal from the beginning of their life. Warapari is our serious adult pathway, going from level 1 through to level 4, so we can grow speakers and we can grow teachers and educators. And in time, an immersion school where the children live their days in Ghana, grounded in Ghana culture on Ghana Yarta. It's long work, but it's steady work, and it's intergenerational.
In Te Ao Māori, there's a whakatauki that goes, he aha te mea nui o te ao. He tangata, he tangata, he tangata. What is the most important thing in the world? It is people, it is people, it is people. This isn't about one family, one child, or one organisation. This is about future Ghana generations. And the platform we build now is the platform they will launch from. They will have work to do too. Our responsibility is to make that work lighter, stronger, more possible. We honour past generations, their strength, their survival, their knowledge, and we build forward so those coming after us inherit more than a whisper. They inherit a language that can be spoken out loud.
Ngarlulu yaka yalara tanda bindi. Ngalulu Tandabindi Tawari Wuta Walulai Dichia.
We are still learning, still growing, still becoming, but we are moving.
Ngalulu Parlaninti Kumarta Mirna Ngalulu Lichanga Kumanga Padniticha Ngadluku Nipurna Ngadluku Taikertirna Ngadluku Yunga Wartana Ngadluku Yaka Wartana Ngadluku Pirku Mani Ngadlu Puruchi Kumanga Wapalayama Ngadluku Warana Karapaticha
We've seen what's possible. We've learned what works. Now we're bringing it home.
Wayanga Wara Nindi Wara Tarakara Nindi Yarta Wangandi Ngalu Licha Ngalulu Dawata Perkana Terkandi Warana Tupa Pankarila Mipur Nanti Karna Wara Kutini Purunani Yarta Wangandi Ngalu Licha Ngalulu Dawata Perkana Terkandi Warana Tupa Pankarila Mipur Nanti Karna Wara Kutini Purunani